Traveling 30 million blocks in Minecraft is not something you do casually, especially in the end dimension where you are constantly at risk of falling to your death. But on the oldest anarchy server in Minecraft, players found a way to travel this distance in less than 1 second. And all you need is a boat and a friend. Called Boat TP, it's been named the most overpowered teleport exploit in 2b2t's history. Needless to say, it was quickly used to cause chaos, with bases being griefed and players fighting for control of end spawn to prevent their enemies from using the very same exploit. As of me making this video, it has been patched, so I'm finally able to talk about the crazy story behind it. Believe it or not, I've actually been working on this video during a hurricane, so you better be hitting that subscribe button. So how exactly was this exploit discovered, used, and eventually weaponized? Well, our story begins with one of the server's most gifted builders, Crowbar, who has built some of the most beautiful and awe-inspiring bases ever seen in the server's end dimension. Many months ago, he noticed that his item stashes and bases scattered throughout the end were being found by groups of Russian players. Considering how far out in the end these places were, it was very unusual that they were being found so quickly. He began questioning if he should move out even farther in the end to protect himself. Another player named Orsond had heard news of the Russian activity and wanted to investigate. As the leader of one of the server's most active griefing groups, the Fifth Column, he was curious if there was an exploit going around that they could use to cause chaos. One day at the main island, if you could even call it that these days, Orsond noticed something highly unusual. Right at the spawn point, the ground was littered with hundreds of enchanted pickaxes, and more kept appearing every so often. This meant that someone was likely sending these items through an end gateway. These mini portals are scattered all over the end, and entering one allows you to return to the main island from anywhere in the dimension. But this also works with items that are thrown into them. The sheer number of pickaxes meant that someone was likely unloading a shulker of them through a gateway. But why? It was clear that some shady business was going on, so Orsond managed to locate a public Discord server of Russian-speaking 2b2t players. He kept it open on his desktop for weeks, occasionally popping in and out of the voice chat to listen in. He couldn't understand what they were saying, but since many would stream their gameplay sessions in the VC, he could potentially find clues about an exploit. For about 3 weeks, he waited patiently, until finally, he saw someone streaming in the end dimension, and he began watching. The player was just standing at end spawn for a few minutes when suddenly, they were teleported millions of blocks away instantly, and were now sitting in a boat for some reason. Orsond had just witnessed Boat TP, and he quickly figured out how it worked. The exploit was actually simple and only required 2 people. We'll call them Player A and Player B. Player A is far away somewhere in the end dimension next to a gateway portal. They place a boat right next to the actual portal block, and have a piston behind it ready to push. Player B then stands at end spawn, and using a hack client enables the auto mount cheat, which, as the name implies, allows you to automatically hop on any rideable entity that is within reach, even if you aren't looking at it. Back at the gateway portal, Player A then sits in the boat and activates the piston to push themselves through. Now, under normal conditions, this would be a one-way trip, and Player A would just be back at spawn inside the boat. But a while back, 2b2t players found a way to crash the server by doing this, so a plugin was introduced to stop boats from going through these small portals. If you attempt to do it, you'll find yourself back on the ground near the original gateway. But despite the plugin, Player A and the boat will still briefly appear at spawn for a fraction of a second before returning to their original location. This is just enough time for Player B to use auto mount to hop in. If performed successfully, Player A would end up back at their original gateway with 1 extra passenger. This meant that as long as one player was willing to travel far out in the end, they could bring as many others with them as they wanted. Boat TP could be performed at every single gateway portal throughout the dimension, so if you were all the way at the end world border, you could travel 30 million blocks instantly, saving countless resources and hundreds of hours of travel time. Who actually discovered this exploit is unknown, but it was clear the Russians were the first group to use it publicly, and explained why they were able to spread out so easily to find crowbar stashes. This was hands down one of the most powerful and broken teleport exploits in the server's history. Orsond and the fifth column began using Boat TP on their own and were surprised at how consistent it was. Since they were a griefing group, the question became, how could they use it to cause chaos? Well, it didn't take long for them to get their wish. It turns out there was a base all the way out near the corner of the end world border, 30 million blocks out in two directions. It was occupied by a group called the Spawn Masons, as well as some of their associates, and they had been pretty public about their presence there. Secretly, the Masons had already been using Boat TP to transport resources out to the border, and the sheer distance was enough to discourage most other griefers. It was the perfect target, and so they came up with a plan. First, they needed to find someone that was willing to teleport them out to the border. Orsond began asking around and offering real-world money to anyone that was willing to do it. Eventually, he would strike a deal with a player named Big Money, who agreed to teleport them there. Next, a fifth column member named Maksitaxi would gather a bunch of PvPers at end spawn to kill anyone attempting to use the exploit, nicknaming themselves the IDCC, the Interdimensional Customs Control. These PvPers would cut off the Masons from getting back to their base, as well as trolling anyone else attempting to use Boat TP at spawn. Finally, once the base was destroyed and everyone had had their fun, they were going to leak the exploit to the server's admin, Housemaster, so that he would patch it and no one else could use it. All of this combined was going to be some serious trolling, and on July 10th, 2022, they put their plans into motion. After a successful transaction, Big Money teleported Orsond to a gateway near the border. Once there, he was able to teleport everyone else on the griefing team. They made their way to the base and started blowing it up, taking the Masons by complete surprise. Anyone that was killed during the attack was not able to return, as the PvPers were patrolling end spawn, killing anyone in render distance. It was a battle happening in two places at once. While the Mason base continued to go up in flames, end spawn had become a war zone with multiple people trying to get back out to their bases, only to get destroyed by the PvPers. A single exploit had caused all of this chaos. Once both the base and the end corner had been griefed, the fifth column leaked the exploit to Housemaster, and the very next day, it was patched. You would think the story ends here, but it turns out there was more going on behind this exploit than most were aware of. Remember how Orsond saw a bunch of pickaxes at end spawn that were never really explained? Well, there's a reason they were there. While performing the Boat TP in a specific way, it was actually possible to duplicate the boat you were using, so when you ended up back at your gateway, there would be two right next to each other. It happened to the fifth column several times over the span of a few weeks, and it was always random. Every single time they attempted to recreate this dupe, it never worked as intended. They theorized that if these boats were getting duped, then there was potentially an item duplication exploit involved with Boat TP, which is why people were dumping items through the end gateway randomly. Either that, or someone had illegally stacked pickaxes that they were unstacking from a shulker by using a gateway. But regardless of how many exploits were secretly at play here, the community was furious that Boat TP was gone, and even Big Money felt betrayed by what the fifth column had done. He didn't expect them to outright leak the exploit to Housemaster, but I guess it just goes to show you why you shouldn't trust griefers. Just like last year with NoCom, an attempted fix of an exploit due to plugins led to an even more powerful and broken one. If a vulnerability exists on a Minecraft server, players will find it eventually, and on 2b2t, this usually results in chaos. If you enjoyed today's video, leave a like, hit that subscribe button, and follow my socials. Stay alive out there, FitFam.